in many cases, the managers have assumed, we've been able to maintain high levels of productivity, things are still getting done, it's all fine. And I think we don't really understand the ways in which the cultures in many, many organizations these days are framed.
So if you're a leader, if you're a manager, if you have a vision to build a company and you think algorithms are going to solve that problem for you, you're in for a big surprise.
HR can't own culture, and compliance can't own culture, and senior leadership can't own culture. Each has a slice of culture, as do employees as a whole. So if we still think in terms of delegating to specific functions to solve these issues, I don't believe they will ever be solved.
When you want to influence culture, when you want to make that a stronger part of your culture, what you need, if you want to change the culture, is to change people's assumptions.
This is Banknotes, Banking Culture Reform. The views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System.
Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of the Banking Culture Reform podcast, part of the New York Fed's initiative to drive awareness and change in financial services culture. This season, we're exploring themes of trust, technology, and the new workplace. We introduced these topics in our 2022 webinars, which you can watch at newyorkfed.org. In this season's podcast, we've brought back panelists from each webinar to take a more in-depth look at their work around these three themes. My name is Tony DiCario, and I'm with the New York Fed's Culture Team. Our guests today are Amir Goldberg and Sameer Srivastava. Amir is an associate professor of organizational behavior at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. Sameer is the Ewald T. Grether Professor of Business Administration and Public Policy at the UC Berkeley Haas School. He also co-directs the UC Berkeley Culture Center. Amir and Sameer co-direct the Computational Culture Lab, a joint initiative between Stanford and Berkeley. Welcome, Sameer and Amir. You're both doing really fascinating work on the intersections between technology and culture. How did each of you get to this point? How did you come to believe that culture is important? Sameer, how about you?
Great. Thanks so much, Tony. And thanks for having us for this conversation. So the answer to your question for me goes back to my undergraduate days when I was an economics major. And I wrote a game theory senior thesis, which was a mathematical model of the behavior of firms and the decisions that managers inside those firms made. And the model worked out really nicely. But then I was looking for empirical examples of actual managers and actual firms behaving this way, and I couldn't find any. And it made me feel really disillusioned about this model and made me think I wanted to really understand how real managers, how real people in organizations made decisions. So rather than pursuing a PhD at that time, which had been my plan, I went into industry and I worked for a management consulting firm. I ended up staying for about 14 years. And spent a lot of time really helping organizations think about aligning their organizations with their competitive strategy, and very quickly came to see the role that social networks and culture both play in the way decisions get made, right? So we might have an idea that we think is right, but then decisions are socially produced through interactions with other people, and who you come into contact with and the nature of those interactions importantly shapes what the outcome is. And so I wanted to really understand that better, and that led me to go back kind of mid-career to do a PhD. This time I decided to go back and do a PhD in sociology rather than economics because it felt like the discipline that better understood and took seriously the role of culture and social networks. And then as I started doing research, which was initially focused more on the role of social networks in shaping individual and organizational outcomes, I began to see that literature was disconnected from the cultural context in which networks operate. And so a lot of the work I've been doing together with Amir, and I'll let him say more about his background, has been really trying to take culture seriously and find new ways of measuring it, new ways of tracking it, and really understanding how people come to create group culture and also how they are influenced by the culture in which they are operating, whether they realize it or not.
Thanks, Amir. Amir, do you want to tell us your origin story a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us. This is really exciting to be here. For me, I think the kind of foundational moment was when I moved to the United States. So I have the advantage and the curse of being an immigrant, but I think it gives you a lot of perspective. I grew up in Israel. which is a very Mediterranean, Middle Eastern culture with a lot of like history and fraught history to it. When you arrive in a different country, you just suddenly become aware of the extent to which things that seem so natural to you are in fact very unique to that particular context. And it's very frustrating because I would say things and I knew that I understood the literal meanings of what I was saying or what other people were telling me, but I didn't understand the implied meanings. One of the most common things that I've noticed in American kind of work culture is people say we should really have coffee sometime, but it's not a literal invitation to having coffee. It's more of a nice way to end a conversation and suggest that maybe in the future there will be an opportunity for us to socialize. And it takes a long time to understand these or the baseball references and what they imply. And that was a moment where I understood that this is such a fascinating and such an important aspect of our social lives, but one that we are so deeply and surrounded by that we don't even see, that you need to travel over the Atlantic to be able to observe it. And that was the moment where I decided that that's what I wanted to study. And it's very difficult to take that distance and to look at yourself and others from the outside and ask yourself, what are the beliefs and interpretations that are shared across a group of people that they believe are just the natural order of things, but in fact are a result of a very rich history that they're mostly unaware of. And that's what's so fascinating about culture. And, with respect to the question of why financial institutions should care about culture, I think there are two main reasons. The first of all is just that because it's around us. You can't escape culture. It's kind of like the fable of the fish that is taken out of the water and asked, how is the water today? And the fish says, what water? So we're swimming in the water of culture, whether we like it or not. And I think financial decision makers, financial leaders that are better aware of how their decisions and interpretations are biased through cultural context are going to make eventually better decisions. And I think it's particularly acute in the finance industry because we know from the study of culture that culture is one of the most unique things that humans have that have enabled us to become such a successful species on this planet. And one of the reasons is because culture is a way for us to share knowledge in a way that no individual could discover by him or herself. And the more the external environment is complex, the more culture becomes an important way for us to resolve some of these uncertainties. And financial markets, by their nature, are complex, and they're just becoming even more and more and more complex. And this was very much clear during the 2008 financial crisis, which was happening while I was doing my PhD studies, where a lot of the decision of investors that seemed to be rational profit maximization types of calculations were in fact driven a lot by cultural processes, by shared interpretations that had nothing to do with the underlying fundamentals of the instruments that they were using. So I think every person should think about culture, but in finance in particular, in light of the complexity of the reality that investors are dealing with.
So Amir, if culture is thought of as kind of just the way things are and the water that we're swimming in, does that mean it can't be changed?
I think what it means is that obviously it can be changed because it's not the natural order of things. But the reason that it is perceived as if it is natural is because it is so deeply shared by people. That's, the technical concept that sociologists and social scientists would use here is something known as social construction. And a social construction is a reality that we have all come to believe is natural, but isn't necessarily the natural order of things. But the reason that it is held so strongly is because everybody shares it. So that means that changing that perception is going to be very difficult. So if you think of, one of the most dramatic achievements in that respect in the 20th century is changing people's perceptions about gender and gender roles. And, in the early 20th century, many people held the position that women are simply incapable of leadership because they're biologically, innately not disposed towards certain types of qualities and behaviors. And it took many thousands of people to provide evidence, to make kind of strong arguments, to protest. But we saw that change happening. And usually when it happens in a landslide, because suddenly it requires a large contingent of people to change their opinions en masse. And then a lot of things happen as a consequence. We saw it also with the gay rights movement in the latter part of the 20th century. Doesn't mean that things can't change, but it means that their opinions are strongly entrenched, and changing people's opinions is an uphill struggle.
So I want to get into the guts of what you both do. One of the themes that we're thinking about this year and that we've been focused on this year is technology and that relationship between technology and culture. This is why we brought you two in. You co-lead the Computational Culture Lab. I'm wondering, Sameer, maybe you can give me an introduction to what the Computational Culture Lab is and what inspired its creation.
Happy to. So I think it's been about 7 years since Amir and I started the lab. And it came about the way a lot of academic collaborations come out, which is I invited Amir to come give a talk at Berkeley, and we had a nice chat afterwards. And he invited me to come give a talk at Stanford, and we had a nice chat afterwards. And then we decided to meet in the middle in San Francisco over lunch to think about research collaboration. And as we started thinking about the ideas that we were both interested in, we also began to realize that the data we would need to really get at these questions just weren't accessible and wouldn't be accessible using the typical methods one has available to study culture, things like surveys. Surveys are incredibly useful, they're very widespread, but they have important limitations, right? They tell you about what people think and what they report in an instrument. They're subject to various forms of reporting bias. They're costly to implement in the sense that it takes time for people to fill them out. In many organizations, response rates to surveys have been on the decline for years. And so we really were starting to think about, are there other ways to get at facets of culture? Again, this is about 7 years ago when we were still relatively early in what I think of now as the digital revolution as it relates to the study of culture. So we started to think about, well, what are data sources that one could use to get at more behavioral indicators of culture, and ones that could be mined so that rather than having to just get data every 3 months or once a year, you could get real-time, continuous measures. So we started thinking about, for example, interactional language use, the idea that people in organizations are routinely communicating with each other. And increasingly, there are digital traces of that, whether it's in emails or whether it's in Slack posts, whether it's on Glassdoor reviews. There are lots of different ways in which we can collect these digital traces. And around the same time, there was proliferation of tools and methods for structuring that data, for analyzing it at scale. Computational costs were declining dramatically. And the tools from computer science and computational linguistics were becoming more readily available. And so I think a big idea, the inspiration for the lab was, can we harness these new data sources and these new methods to help us tackle good old-fashioned social science questions, but in new ways? And that, I think, is really, in some sense, an encapsulation of what we've been trying to do. Amir, what would you add?
I think you provided a fantastic answer. I will just add that, related to your first question about our backgrounds, I think also Sameer and I come from slightly different training backgrounds. Sameer started in economics and then went into consulting, kind of experienced the limitations of the theories and the practices firsthand. I did my undergraduate degree in computer science, and I also kind of understood that this was a moment where data, digitization, new algorithmic capabilities are going to revolutionize how we think about quote unquote softest aspects of human interaction and sociability. And we were very excited because we knew that these technologies are out there, but that our friends in computer science and in statistics weren't thinking about culture as their immediate candidate. And that was an opportunity to be seized, but also a way to move the needle.
So maybe, Amir, you can go into as layman terms as possible. What are some of these computational methods that you're using? And then you can talk a little bit perhaps about exactly how you're applying them to aspects of culture.
Sure. So, one of the biggest advancements in computation and in quote unquote artificial intelligence, which is, as a side note, I would say, a term I dislike, because we're definitely haven't reached the moment of an intelligent artificial algorithm in the sense that humans intuitively understand intelligence. But one of the biggest advances over the last 10, 15 decades has been in natural language processing. The pace at which these algorithms are developing is just staggering. Since Sameer and I started the lab, the pace has been unmanageable. If you don't stay up to speed with what's happening in engineering and computer science for a few months, you really lose out. If you use methods that were developed in 2018 and it's 2022, you're like a century behind. So it's exciting. And what these advances have kind of implied are several things. First of all, they have systematically are able to analyze text at scale in a way that no human can. A human can code maybe hundreds or thousands of documents. These algorithms can scan millions, billions of documents and learn something from them. And recently, there's really been a lot of advancement in semantics, basically in understanding the underlying meanings, and not just the statistical patterns of text. So, in the late 1990s, the way by which natural language processing happened was that you would count frequencies and you would look at, okay, how many negative words, how many positive words. Now there are what's known as deep learning methods, and we won't get into the details of what exactly differentiates deep learning from other forms of learning, but these are machine learning algorithms that appear to be able to represent semantics in a way that's quite consistent with how humans understand the meanings of words and the meanings of sentences. And some of the novel algorithms are just amazing. I encourage everybody who's listening to this podcast to go to OpenAI's GPT-3 model and play with it a little bit. You ask it questions and it answers quite astonishingly well. It's quite easy to break it. So you will very quickly realize that it's not intelligent in the way that humans are, but for certain tasks, its ability to answer very open-ended questions is astonishing. And we use that as a way to try and infer, what do people mean when they say, let's have coffee sometime? And do these set of people mean different things than this set of people? And can we learn something about what's driving their behavior and why they're making the decisions that they're making by bringing in the insights that these algorithms are giving us? So in one of our current studies, that I think is going to be very relevant to the topic of our conversation, we analyze the text in quarterly earning calls where executives talk to analysts and describe their firm performance and their vision and their strategy, et cetera. So one of the things that we've done was to apply one family of algorithms known as word embeddings. These are deep learning algorithms, are quite amazing in inferring semantics. So what they are really good at doing is they study a large body of text and they can locate each word in a multidimensional space. And it turns out that the distances between these words in that space strongly correspond to how humans understand the meanings of words. So the word dog and cat will end up being far closer in space than dog and podcast, which are semantically unrelated terms. So what we've done is we used that attribute of word embedding models to analyze the text of executives in quarterly earning calls. And when we observe an executive speaking in such a call, we ask, is the way that this person is speaking semantically similar or different from how her competitors are speaking contemporaneously? We call this performative atypicality. So how atypical they are in their performance, in their linguistic performance in these calls. And we find something quite interesting. We find that firms whose executives speak atypically in these types of calls, analysts tend to kind of overestimate the future performance of these firms, which ironically leads to a negative earnings surprise. They are kind of overbuoyant about how this firm is going to perform. And we find that this is especially the case if these executives' atypicality kind of emulates the way by which celebrated innovators speak. That tends to influence analysts and to bias them to believe that you have something special. They believe it so much that they are overly optimistic about how well your firm is going to perform in the future. So that's just one example of how you can use these algorithms at scale to discover these patterns that are quite subtle and would have been extremely difficult for a human coder to understand at scale.
That's so interesting because my intuition would be the opposite. I've been, part of lots of different cultures in my life, right? It's not just your work culture, it's the culture of your family, the culture of any sort of kind of identity that you might have has a culture associated with it. And I find that people often end up also using the same words. We do have shared meanings and we even have shared ways of saying things. Even intonation, sometimes you kind of people start to really sound alike. And so my intuition would be that it gives people kind of comfort to hear someone who sounds like the others that are doing something similar. And in fact, maybe that is what you're saying. It's just like the visionaries of that group are who do well. But what about if you speak differently, but not like a visionary, just like yourself?
You're absolutely right. This is like a perennial tension, not just in quarterly earning calls, but in every social situation. There's these kind of cross pressures of fitting in, but also being different. When you're dating, you don't want to be too weird, but you don't want to look like everybody else, right? When you're making a presentation, when you're talking at the family dinner, you don't just want to parrot what everybody else said, but you also don't want to be entirely unintelligible. There are different ways for people to look different and to be similar. What's really interesting is that if you are idiosyncratically different, you just look weird. If you are, however, kind of are very good at picking on the subtle ways by which innovation and creativity are conventionally understood, and you are able to differentiate yourself from others in that way, that's when that has the biggest effect. I kind of think about it as like being cool, right? What does it mean to be cool? Just being different doesn't make you cool. There are the right and the wrong ways of being cool. And I think there are also right and wrong ways of being cool in quarterly earning calls in a way that very kind of subconsciously affects the interpretations of analysts. And what Sameer and I enjoy is that you can use algorithms to identify that in a way that none of us could have done it individually. When we read those transcripts, we just drown in the data. We don't understand what's going on. We need the help of the algorithm to do that for us. Sameer, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, that Amir and I figured a lot of things out over the last 7 years, but one thing we haven't figured out is the right way to be cool. Still working on that.
I think you're cool. I think this is cool.
Very kind of you to say. So the other example I wanted to highlight, which is from the financial services sector, is the use of such tools that Amir was just describing to actually measure post-merger cultural integration. The specific manifestation here is just a machine learning classifier, right? It's a way of trying to take a given form of communication. In this case, we take email messages and we try to classify them. Is this a message that was written in the style of the legacy organization pre-merger? And to what extent can we actually distinguish between the language being used by people post-merger? And what this allows us to do, the kind of academic research side of it, is trying to develop a language-based measure of what we refer to as symbolic boundaries, but which people in organizations would think about as the various subtle us-them distinctions that we maintain between groups. And we do this all the time, and we do it often automatically. But it turns out we can actually assess this in language. We can see people communicating in ways that reify their old legacy organization. And we see people coming up, even as culture shifts and language changes, finding new ways to draw cultural distinctions between their group and the other group. And so in this particular setting where we have one bank that buys two other banks and integrates with them, we can actually assess where people are in terms of their linguistic style, and 18 months after the fact, still figure out what their legacy organization was. And then from a managerial perspective, this type of approach helped us give the leadership team some advice about which bank branches, for example, are better or less well culturally integrated, and therefore where do they need to spend their time, right? That's an example of how these tools can be used for managerial purposes, but in ways that are not about revealing any individual score or doing so in ways that can be used in nefarious ways. So you can use it as a responsible tool, but we can talk more about this. We need to put in some safeguards to make sure they're used responsibly.
Yeah, and I definitely want to spend some time on that, but I want to spend a little more time on the research first. Sameer, it would seem like if you can use this post-acquisition to figure out kind of maybe where the holdouts are, you could apply it to any organization to see subcultures. And the existence of subcultures isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, there are going to be subcultures in any big organization. You can't have one behemoth. If we've learned anything, we've learned that. You can see, my understanding of semantic similarities is that what you can see is kind of how tight that subculture is. If I'm able to describe what Amir explained about semantic similarities, you can kind of physically map how people kind of associate different concepts, how closely they associate different concepts to one another. And the more similar those maps are to one another, that each individual's map is to one another, kind of the more semantic similarity they have. I wonder, kind of, what does that reveal about a group? Is there something either kind of good or bad that can be deduced from how close they are?
So a couple of things in what you said that I want to pick up on, Tony. One is, you're absolutely right. You're talking about similarities and differences. And that reflects a way that Amir and I have really approached this question of culture, which is, broadly speaking, you could think about content-based approaches to culture. These are ones that emphasize certain terms or certain values. We're innovation-focused or adaptability-focused or integrity-focused. Or you can think about this distributional approach to culture, which is, to what extent are individuals and groups and the organization as a whole similar to or different from other entities, culturally independent of what that content is. And these methods that we've been describing are especially good at the latter. Of course, we can get at the former too, but they're especially good at the latter. And so one of the things that you can start to see, going back to subcultures, is that managers and leaders have assumptions they make, mental models about where the subcultures exist. And those assumptions typically follow the contours of formal structure. We're going to assume, those risk management people have this kind of culture, and the lawyers have that kind of culture, and so on, right? But with data like this, one can actually find subcultures that sometimes cut across groups. So the assumptions we have, that the stereotypes almost we have about groups may or may not hold. We may find that there are subcultures that exist that are totally independent of these groups. And then we can start to investigate, and this is a harder question of trying to pin down when a subculture is harmful or hurtful, because sometimes subcultures form in response to bad performance as opposed to causing the bad performance. So the causality can be difficult, but you could then begin, once you've identified those subcultures, then you can start examining the consequences of those cultures.
We've spoken with other guests about network analysis and kind of the understanding you can have about subcultures and where your kind of nodes of influence are using network analysis. So this sounds to me like you can actually come up with some similar information using NLP. Have you done any work combining the two?
Amir, do you want to take this one?
Yes, we have. Some of our earliest work was precisely focused on the relationship between networks and culture. I would say, to begin with, is that there is the assumption that culture and the structure of the network necessarily are coextensive with one another. So you would imagine if we have an organization where one group of people only interact with themselves and the other group of people interact with themselves too, and there's very little bridging between them, that there should be different cultures emerging in these two subgroups. That's often the case, but it's not necessarily the case. And good organizations can actually cultivate shared cultures, even if there are pockets of dense interaction that don't have a lot of bridges across them. Our early investigations were to try and explore this type of duality. And one of the things that we found, quite interestingly, was that there's a trade-off, especially if we look at individuals, between the tendency to align and become very similar to your colleagues and your peers that you interact with, or be different with them, and it's contingent on the type of network that you are part of. So on average, a general finding in the study of culture is that there are high returns to conformism and to thinking like other people around you. Most people who express different opinions are just shunned by their peers and we never hear about them. So for every Steve Jobs, there are probably thousands of Steve Jobs wannabes. So, but we found that actually when you are embedded in a very dense network where your colleagues have strong friendships with one another, you're kind of a part of a quasi-family in the organization. That's when you have more latitude to be a little bit different. I like to think about it as kind of your weird uncle during a family dinner. The uncle is part of the family and he knows that he has kind of the security of the trust of the family members are not ever going to kick him out. And he can occasionally say weird things, but nobody is going to suspect him for trying to sabotage, the family. So there's an interesting trade-off there. And I think there are also insights for managers. Some organizations need to cultivate more heterodox cultures, need to encourage people thinking outside of the box, especially if there are competitive advantages around innovation and creativity. And the insight would be that if you want to encourage people to think outside the box, you need to create networks that provide the kind of social safety net for people to express unconventional opinions and not risk the penalty of being shunned as a consequence. So the two are not necessarily coextensive with one another.
Could I just add also that network analysis, of course, is a mature tool and technology. And broadly speaking, there are kind of two approaches to it. One is there are a lot of firms now out there that are providing services around meta-analysis of internal communications, right? So we can get through just the metadata on who's sending email messages to whom or who's sending Slack communications to whom, the structure of the communication network and how it changes over time. And that's great for understanding the network at scale. And then there's another approach, which is to run a network survey where people are asked to nominate those who are in their network or they've gone to for different kinds of resources. That can be really useful for getting at the content of the tie. The metadata doesn't tell you anything about who's mentoring whom or who's seeking information from whom or who's sabotaging whom. All you know is that they're in touch with each other. The survey data gives you much better insight into what's flowing through the tie, but it's very hard to collect those data at scale, especially if you're a larger organization. You get all kinds of, again, recall bias. These are well-documented biases in whom we tend to list when we're asked a network question. So to me, one of the opportunities is really to bring language analysis into better dialogue with network analysis, just as you were suggesting, Tony, because through language, we can get a much richer insight into the content of what's flowing through a network. And through the digital trace metadata, we can get much more comprehensive insights into who's communicating with whom. And there's some work that we have underway right now that's trying to do just that together with the validated survey.
I actually have the benefit of having read some of your research that I don't think has actually come out yet into semantic similarities, which is why I was able to get it on the first try, because I had the benefit of reading a little bit about it in advance. And one of the stories that you talk about in your research that hopefully we'll be able to link to in the notes to this show is levels of what you call organizational identification. We've started to get into that a little bit with your identification of subgroups, but this is kind of a larger organizational question. I'd be interested in having you describe kind of what organizational identification is, how you're able to measure it, and why this approach is potentially superior to surveys.
Generally speaking, there is a huge limitation with survey analysis. At the outset, I just want to say, I don't think that algorithmic approaches are necessarily superior to surveys. There are certain things that surveys can get that you cannot get by using our approaches. But the limitations are, aside from the obvious limitations, which are scale and granularity, you can't ask the same person to answer a survey day in, day out, and do it like at huge scale. People will get pissed off, and it's just simply not a viable option. But aside from that, when you ask people a question in a survey, you activate their conscious cognition, and they become self-aware. And often they give you unreliable answers, not because they're lying, but because their self-presentational self is very different from their authentic self, and they sometimes are unaware of it. We all are. We have been socialized heavily not to be authentic. Right? When we go up the elevator and there's somebody that looks weird to us, we're not going to say to them, hey, you look weird. We have been very kind of aggressively socialized to keep our opinions to ourselves. And that happens when we answer surveys. What this means is that especially when your employer is asking you questions, you're going to put on your presentational self, whether you do it consciously or not, and that's going to skew the answer. You're probably going to answer your kind of ideal answer, what you would have liked, as opposed to what you truly experience at that moment. So that's the advantage of using our methods relative to surveys, especially when you ask these kind of very abstract but fundamental questions. How strongly do you identify with an organization? And the other thing is that when you think about the problem of identification, by problem I mean as a social scientific question. Why do people identify more than others? Is it something about the difference between different organizations? Are simply certain managers or leaders better at cultivating identification? Is it about the difference between different individuals? Or maybe there are actually a lot of circumstantial, situational differences that lead to the fact that there's actually a lot of variance within people over time. And we all experience that. When we were hired, our level of identification with our employer kind of fluctuates. It's a function of a lot of things that are happening in our lives and in our professional and work lives. And when you bring our methodology at scale, you can suddenly look at those trends with a magnifying glass in a way that a survey could simply never afford. And we were able to discover that, yes, a lot of the difference in why some people identify more than others has to do with stable differences between individuals. Some people are just like Groucho Marx. They're cynics. They don't want to be a member of a club that would accept them as a member. Some people are very kind of gung-ho, would want to be a member of any club, whether it accepts them or not. A lot of the difference is explained by that, but we also discover that the type of networks that you're embedded in, to build on the research that I described earlier, whether you are a member of this tight-knit group, really appears to affect your level of identification. I want to take Sameer's caution. We don't know exactly what is the causal direction here. Is it because you identify that you create a certain network around you, or is it because you have a network that your identification intensifies or weakens? But we definitely see a relationship between the two. The more you're part of a tight-knit group, the stronger your identification with the organization. But also, the more your relationships somehow span across the organization, where you have access, whether directly or indirectly through your immediate colleagues, to people who are scattered across the organization and are not only exclusively members of your particular subculture, do you also identify more with the group? There are two kind of trends here. It's you want to be part of a dense clique, but at the same time, you don't want your clique to be an island that's entirely disconnected from the mothership. We believe that this isn't actually only true about organizations. Maybe this is a way for us to think about some of the problems that the United States and actually all industrialized countries are experiencing right now about political polarization, ethnic animosity between subgroups. There's something about being able to be simultaneously part of a strong community, but also feeling that your community has ties to other communities that intensifies your identification with a higher order group. Sameer, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add just a couple of things. So one is just in terms of the specifics of the measurement strategy. So again, this is a paper in which we use these word embedding models that Amir previously described, and we focus in particular on pronoun use. So there have been prior attempts to try to measure facets of identification based on just the counts, again, of we language or I language, right? To what extent am I thinking about the collective when I'm communicating? But here we're trying to measure something a little bit more subtle, which is the degree to which my conception of the self, that is I, overlaps with my conception of the collective, that is the we. And this is something which you can't measure through just sheer counts of words, right? We have to actually look at the semantic meaning, just as you were saying, Tony, between these words and how it shifts over time. And you can actually see that for those who identify more strongly, as measured, for example, in survey data, that they, over time, come to have greater overlap. Like they literally are thinking about the self and the group in ways that are more aligned, that are more in unison. And that, we think, is the novelty of the measurement strategy. I also very quickly wanted to name some of the collaborators on the various projects we've just mentioned, because we have not mentioned them. So the project that Amir mentioned with analyst calls, that's with Paul Guvar, who's an alumnus of the lab now at the University of Lugano. The project I described using the post-merger integration in financial services, cultural integration, is with Anjali Bhatt, who is an alumna of our lab, now a professor at Harvard Business School. Govind Manian is an alumnus of the lab who was involved in the project that Amir mentioned regarding fitting in or standing out. This last one is with a current PhD student, Laura Yang.
You forgot to mention our colleague, Chris Potts at Computer Science and Linguistics, who was involved in some of our earlier research.
Absolutely.
So you're spreading your network. You've got them moving out, building their own networks. Okay, so I could actually get into the nitty-gritty of your studies all day long, but I do want to move into a discussion of the ethics of all of this, because I think that's really important, and it's a pretty big debate. What is the line between kind of using these powers for good and using these powers for bad?
I'm happy to go first on this one. I'll give you an example of the use of these tools in what I think are really misguided ways. So there's an organization, I won't name it, that we came across that uses some of these same tools, and they get access to internal communication data from a subset of firms, and they mine these data, and they can predict, because it's not that hard to predict, when someone is at risk of exiting the firm. And it's one thing to make these predictions across large groups or to look at these aggregate patterns, but it's quite another thing when you get down to the individual level. And if we're trying to predict, Tony, when you might leave the Fed, that's a very, very sensitive thing, which if that's known to you or known to leaders, can have all kinds of unintended consequences. How your manager then treats you or doesn't treat you, or what opportunities become available to you or don't become available to you. And this particular organization was producing reports, weekly reports for all people managers with the predicted probabilities of each of their people leaving at the end of the month. And not only were these subject to false precision to the nth degree, you'd get predictions of 10.56%, right, which we just know is ridiculous given the accuracy of these models, but there was no attempt to think about unintended consequences. And so I think among the things that we encourage firms to do, of course, we can collaborate with them on research, and we can put in place our own protocols, and our universities require us to put in place protocols to protect human subjects. And of course, we follow those. But after we leave, firms can do what they wish. And our advice to them is to really think about using these tools in ways that are about self-empowerment of employees rather than that are about surveillance and monitoring and using them in punitive kinds of ways. Insofar as these are opt-in tools, we think they're much, much better. So, imagine a set of tools, and these are out there where people can opt in and get data reports that are just for them on how they're communicating, and maybe some suggestions for what they could be doing differently and better. That seems like a really useful tool, a force for good. But I think the other important point here is transparency. So if it becomes known that such data are being used, and they're being used in ways that are opaque and mysterious, it will very quickly erode trust in the organization, very quickly erode trust in leadership, and in very subtle but predictable ways actually destroy the culture of the organization. So, and whenever we do this kind of work, we'll often go to a town hall meeting and explain exactly what data we're working with and what the procedure is for de-identifying the data, and show some examples of here's a raw text and here's what it looks like after it's been processed, and answer questions, because we think that kind of approach is really what people need to feel like these tools, can be a force for good as opposed to evil.
If I may add to that, I think technology is morally neutral. Atomic energy was used to reduce the cost of producing energy and has had huge environmental positive effects, but it also killed hundreds of thousands of people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So really the technology in and of itself affords all kinds of things. And the question is, how do people use it? So I think it's really important that researchers like us are being held accountable by the public. It's really important that organizations are being held accountable by the public. I want to say very clearly, I don't trust organizations that are going to do the right thing. I think it's true what Sameer said, that doing the right thing ethically will probably be the right thing also from a profit maximizing perspective, because the downside of ruining your culture is huge. So you want to self-empower and you want to make sure that you're not alienating your employees. But I think there are two particular risks with the use of technology of this type. The first is that when you use data, quote unquote, you have the false confidence that you have some objective representation of reality. We researchers understand that this is not the case. Figuring out what causes what, or whether the measurement actually truly measures what we think it measures in the world, is so complicated, and we argue about it all the time. But when a manager is presented by some this person is 2.3% more likely to leave than that person, we understand that that number is probably meaningless. And it might only mean something when you look at the aggregate, but not at one individual. So that's very dangerous. I don't think that managers are numerically kind of educated in a way that they understand statistics to make the right inferences, and that's our responsibility as educators. The second thing is that a huge danger here is that the same algorithms might be deployed across multiple systems. And if those algorithms are biased, and they are by definition biased because they are trained on data that was produced by humans who are biased, the same person might be disadvantaged across different contexts. So they will be seen as a misfit culturally in that firm and in another firm, and they might not be hired, and they might not get credit. The use of algorithms introduces all kinds of new problems, even though the general problem, which is how do we evaluate other people, is problematic whether an algorithm does it or whether another human does it. And I think it's our responsibility as a society to have that conversation. I'm always disappointed. I hear, Biden and Trump and others talk about a lot of things. They rarely talk about these issues. This is like one of the most pressing problems of our time, period. And we have to talk about it.
And actually, one of the other topics that we've been really focused on this year, there have been three. Technology is one of them, and trust is another one. And trust isn't just an issue with financial services firms, although that was a huge issue coming out of the financial crisis. But trust is an issue everywhere with everyone these days. Are there ways that technology can be harnessed to actually improve trust, or more specifically within organizations to enhance psychological safety? I mean, is there a way to fight this using technology?
I mean, so let's just take an example of the self-empowerment tools we talked about. So in many cases, what leads a workplace or a social group to feel less psychologically safe is because people communicate sometimes in unintended ways that signal that they are being judgy or evaluative, or that someone else's ideas aren't worthy. And again, it's sometimes you're engaging difference. You're not necessarily denigrating when you're interacting with somebody, but that's how they perceive it, right? And so an example of a way technology can help with the building of trust is by giving people some tools. You're about to communicate in a way, whether you intended to or not, that the other person is likely to perceive as denigrating. And if that's your intention, go ahead. But if it wasn't, maybe you want to self-correct, and the person can choose to do it or not do it. It's not shared with the managers. It's not used for performance management. It's just a way to help the person become aware that they may be stepping into something that's going to undermine trust, right? And so that's just one simple example of how you could use it.
I'm curious about how you actually reassure people that their data isn't being looked at, though, that it's genuinely just for them. Don't you run into kind of given the state of trust in our society, don't you kind of run into the problem of people thinking, nah, they're using this for something else. I just don't believe them.
Of course you do. And I think the fundamental challenge of leadership is to build trustful relationships. So if you're a leader, if you're a manager, if you have a vision to build a company and you think algorithms are going to solve that problem for you, you're in for a big surprise. This is sometimes the wrong way of thinking about this whole discussion of using algorithms in work and basically in other contexts where there's human productivity, is to think about them as complete substitutes. Okay, we're going to just outsource this job to the algorithm. I don't think that's what's going to happen. What is going to happen is good, thoughtful leaders are going to ask themselves, what are the various tasks that I can use the algorithm either to fully substitute me on or to give me good predictive analytics on? What are tasks that I've never done that the algorithm now enables me to do? But there are certain things that I need to continue doing. And building trust with your employees is one of the most important things that a manager does. So it's not something about the design of the algorithm, in my view. It is something about the culture of the firm and my knowledge that when my manager tells me we're implementing this algorithm as a self-empowerment tool, that I can trust them to live by their promise. And we know from many, many years of research in organizational behavior that the way to do it is not just through exercising cheap talk, is when managers show that they're willing to make sacrifices when these types of dilemmas emerge, that they're willing to pay a cost, that the company is willing to pay a cost in order to protect its values. That's the only way to communicate to employees that there's true kind of action behind those words that are otherwise vacuous. Nobody in Enron said, our goal is to cheat our customers. They surely had like very beautiful statements about how important trust is for them, but in practice, they never implemented that. So I don't think algorithms change any of that. They just introduce new types of challenges and problems, and good leaders are gonna need to think hard about how to solve these problems. Sorry, we're not gonna solve that problem for you.
I think that sums it up. All right, I have just a few more questions, kind of rapid fire. What's on the horizon? Kind of what directions do you plan to take your research going forward? Can you give us kind of a sneak peek?
I'm happy to go first on this one. So I think one of the things that we've alluded to is the need to validate a lot of the digital trace measures we've talked about, right? And so we have just started on a few projects where we're bringing together traditional surveys with digital trace data and measures. And I think a really important question is to understand the conditions under which the two are aligned and tell us something similar, the conditions under which they tell us about different facets of culture, And when some of the new measures we're developing actually aren't all that informative at all, which I think is going to be the case for many of these. The sort of metaphor that comes to mind in thinking about where we are with the explosion of some of these tools is, the drunk searching for keys under the lamppost, in the sense that right now there's a huge amount of effort on mining existing and readily available data. So Amir and I had one of the first papers that tried to measure organizational culture using Glassdoor reviews. Since then, there's been an explosion of papers, and now a firm that's even providing culture scores based on Glassdoor data. And it's great because the data are widely accessible and you can work with them and you can do lots of things. But if you really think about it, there are a lot of problems with those data too, right? We have certain people selecting onto the platform and writing a review or not writing a review, what leads them to show up on the platform or not. We know that some HR organizations game Glassdoor reviews, particularly right before the best places to work lists get generated. We know that there are structured prompts on such platforms that get you only a window into certain facets of questions. So if we think about it, to me, another big question is there's a whole range of data available, some of which is easy to get, some of which is less easy to get. So this interaction that we're having right now over Zoom has a lot of cultural signal in it that has yet to be mined. We have facial expressions we're making, nonverbal layers of communication. We have paraverbal layers of communication in terms of how we say what we say, the tone and the pauses and so on. We have various acts of subtle deference and lack of deference happening amongst us. And there's culture in there. So getting at some of these other facets of culture beyond what we can just measure through text in these structured forms, I think is a big area. And then the last part, which we can talk about more, is really understanding what works or doesn't work in terms of changing culture. And I think to do that well, we're going to have to think about running randomized controlled trials of the kind that get run in pharmaceuticals and that firms actually do all the time with their websites, A/B testing. But we don't really do good A/B testing as it relates to cultural practices, and we should.
So, Sameer, maybe you could give some examples of ways that actually academia and industry could work together to do some of that testing.
Yeah, so I think there's a few different ideas that come to mind. One is, Amir and I, and not just us, a whole range of people within and outside our lab are developing new ways of measuring culture. We're publishing this stuff mostly in academic journals. And then there are providers out there that purport to provide different ways of measuring culture through platforms and tools. The two worlds have generally not been that well connected. And so I think one simple approach would be, how do you take some of the research findings and begin to responsibly productize them in ways that will provide insight without the negative consequences we talked about? Second is this idea of a randomized controlled trial at scale, which we refer to as a mega study. And one of the things I know, Tony, you and I have talked about is the idea of a financial services focused mega study that would be about trying to shift the culture across a set of banks and institutions. And that's something that we're very excited to explore. But I think a third area that comes to mind is a lot of the focus in organizations is about what's happening inside and what's happening to the employees of the organization, or maybe just to the direct customer. But I think a really important untapped opportunity is for the academic world and the world of practice to come together to understand the broader social impact of what happens in organizations. And here I'm thinking about, in the banking world, what happens in underserved communities. So we know, for example, from the work of Fred Weary, who's a sociologist at Princeton, about the importance of dignity and respect. And a big factor in why people in those communities are hesitant to go to their banks and instead often choose to go to the payday lender, that's nearby, is because they actually get treated with more dignity and respect. So here's an example of how the internal culture inside of banks has a consequence that spills over and is having a negative influence on society in terms of inequalities in the world. There's another very nice recent paper by Mario Small, a sociologist at Columbia, who's looked at literally the travel time. How long does it take you to walk to the nearest payday lender versus the nearest bank branch if you live in a low-income community? And it turns out it actually takes more time to get to the bank branch, right? The locational choices we're making are also having negative consequences. So I think more work to really understand like the spillovers and how the financial services sector is contributing to and hopefully over time helping to address these bigger social problems is a real important next step too.
That's fascinating. Amir, do you have anything to add?
Sameer and I are both positioned in a place that allows us to interface with industry more than in most academic positions because we operate in business schools. So I interact a lot with my MBA students and with alumni and with executives who come here to do executive education sessions. And I often find that the conversation is very fruitful. There's also sometimes a danger when firms and academics collaborate, because then the financial for-profit incentives and the knowledge generation incentives can get kind of intertwined and might contaminate one another. So it's often very important for us to very clearly create that boundary and say, the research is intended to advance knowledge on the topic, not to advance your revenue in particular. And I found there are some firms that are amazing and willing to actually make that sacrifice for the common good. Some are less so. I also think, pursuant our conversation earlier on the ethics of it, that I think we should have a tighter relationship with nonprofit organizations, with government, and to encourage the conversation around these topics as policymakers are trying to address policy to a changing world. Here at Stanford, there's the HAI, the Human-Centered AI Center, which is really leading the world in terms of discussions around the implications of AI and its societal impact, its economic impact. And I would like government, business, academics to be involved in those conversations. And I hope that voters will demand those conversations to be had, because everybody's going to be influenced by it, algorithmic, whether you want it or not. Algorithmic decision makers are going to be there when you get hired, are going to be there when your salary is being negotiated, when your credit is going to be negotiated, when you buy a ticket for an airline ticket, it's already being driven by algorithms. And we need to have a very kind of robust conversation about what's the role of government and what is the responsibility of organizations, and making sure that the kind of inequalities that Sameer spoke about earlier are not reinforced at scale.
One last thing I wanted to say on this topic is, for those who are interested in getting better connected to the world of academic research, one vehicle for doing that is the Berkeley Culture Center, which I co-direct with my colleague, Jenny Chapman. We have an annual conference that brings together industry leaders who are thinking about culture, as well as academics around the world who are studying culture from different disciplinary vantage points, and a series of ongoing initiatives that people can use to engage with academics throughout the year, including on joint research. So if you're interested, feel free to check that out, Berkeley Culture Center.
Yeah, it's a great program, and it exactly kind of embodies this academia business relationship, but in a way where the different objectives of these different parties are still maintained. Researchers are coming in to talk about the researchers and research, and business leaders are coming in to voice their opinions and to learn new things. So it's a really amazing initiative that Sameer built.
That's a great resource. Thank you. Final question. If you could make one recommendation, each of you, to the people running financial firms when it comes to influencing culture, what would it be? Amir, I'll start with you.
I would say, get out of your comfort zone and speak to people. You can't learn about culture by looking at aggregate statistics or dashboards or reading Harvard Business Review articles. You need to go and talk to people, and you need to go to talk to people across all ranks in your organization, but also across all of your constituents outside your organization, and not just your immediate stakeholders like your investors or your board members, but your customers, especially the customers that are, culturally most distant from you. And if you don't talk to them, you won't know. The only way to discover things you don't know is to have conversation. You can't imagine what you don't know unless you actually engage in interaction.
The famous unknown unknowns.
Yeah, and it's funny, Amir and I did not coordinate on this, but I wrote down one word on this question as you were asking it, Tony, which is ethnography. This was the way in which people did culture work a long time ago, is they would go, as Amir said, and observe and interact and ask questions and learn. And I think this whole idea of the old management by walking around has in many ways been lost. And in the post-pandemic world, where we're in hybrid modes of operating and there's much more remote work, I think it's even harder to do. And I think in many cases, managers have assumed, we've been able to maintain high levels of productivity, things are still getting done, it's all fine. And I think we don't really understand the ways in which the cultures in many, many organizations these days are framed. And it's partly through the walking around, the equivalent of walking around in a hybrid world, that managers will get some intuition for it. And then if you pair that intuition with good, rigorous data, I think that's what's going to help managers figure out what to do about this.
I was struck by the fact that after the whole conversation we've had about technology, both of your recommendations were very analog. They were very human. Also, something that your research reminded me of is a Microsoft study that looked at how cultures changed over the course of the pandemic and found that actually silos became much stronger and the links between them became weaker. Is that a permanent change? Are we seeing maybe, in Amir's words, a return to closer community? Or are we likely to go back to our more global ways?
First of all, the thing that researchers hate doing most is making predictions about the future. We're good at studying the past rather than making predictions about the future, but I'm going to go on a limb and I'm going to say we're definitely not going back to February 2020. That's evident already. And then we need to ask ourselves what has changed. Actually, a lot of the trends that we were seeing before the pandemic were simply exacerbated by the pandemic because we suddenly discovered that we can interact over Zoom and we can be productive, but also the communities that we're part of are starting to change, and there's greater sense of isolation and a mental health kind of epidemic that was catalyzed as a consequence. My personal view is that the important thing that has happened through the Zoomification of work catalyzed by the pandemic is that the boundary between the home and work has really, really been blurred. And that is a boundary that it took an industrial revolution to create. So it was a huge accomplishment of the 19th century to create this idea that, there's a private self that you are at home where you are maybe a parent or a spouse or a child, but then you go to the office and you occupy a role, and there's a lot of symbolic movement there. You wear different clothes, and you also physically move to one space from one space to the other, and that has been kind of vehemently and very dramatically disrupted during the pandemic. And I think the repercussions are going to be huge. And one of the biggest questions we need to ask ourselves is, if you think about it, a lot of the contemporary American's life is defined by the organization that employs them. When you ask people, what do you do? The first thing they say is who they work for. That's a huge part of who they are. That's a huge part of how they create relationships, especially amongst the upper middle classes, the educated knowledge kind of workers who tend to work for a firm that's thousands of miles away from where they grew up. So I think all of that is going to change. And one of the biggest challenges that leaders are going to have is, what does it mean to have people whose sense of self is diminishingly related to who they are employed by? And we have also the technologies now to intermediate work, kind of the Uberification of work. That might mean that you could work for multiple organizations and you don't have to be exclusively employed by any of them. I think those are huge questions and huge changes that are going to emerge. So if we need to make a prediction in the long run, I think that 100 or 200 years from now, we will look at 2020 as an inflection point in redefining the way that people understand themselves socially insofar as the organization that employs them plays a role in that definition.
That's so interesting, because at the same time that you have this strengthening of subcultures and this kind of strengthening of small communities and small groups, you also have, and you touched on this, Amir, kind of a hyper individualization of our experience. And those would seem to be working at cross purposes.
Yeah, but we talked about human nature earlier. Human nature changes. If we think about human nature as something that's embedded in our DNA, that changes on a far longer scale and a time horizon than our beliefs and our perceptions. And there's clearly some incongruity between the technological environments that we've created and our evolutionarily produced need for being co-present with other people. There's something that happens through scent, through motion, that we don't fully understand, that technology doesn't intermediate.
Going back to this idea of experimentation and of like really understanding what works and what doesn't work, we don't know, as Amir was saying, what the future ought to look like, right? We know it's not February 2020, but it's probably also not just having Zoom calls with your immediate work team and being productive, because people lose a sense of meaning and purpose if all they're doing is producing outputs, right? A big part of work life in most of the 20th century was this was your social world. You would go and you might meet your spouse there. You might, have close friends that you stay with for the rest of your life that form there. And so we have to figure out a way to reproduce some elements of the organization as a social world, but in this new reality. And what does that mean in terms of how often are people coming back physically versus not? What are the ways in which they're connecting through a technology when it's not just about having a meeting to make a decision or to get work done, when it's just socializing? What does that look like and how do you make it meaningful? No one, as far as I know, has any good answers to that. Managers have, in some cases, very strong points of view. Should be 3 days a week, should be 2 days a week, that are not informed by any data, as far as I can tell. And this is another opportunity where we could actually learn by running some structured experiments. Let's see what actually is the minimum level of in-person interaction needed to have meaningful experiences at work. And that's knowable.
But wait, you said reproduce, and I think that's a big question. Do we want to reproduce, or do we want to imagine a new type of social world? And I think parts would be reproduced and parts are going to be new. And experimentation is happening all around us already. It's not systematized in the way that academics would want it to be necessarily, but firms are experimenting.
I would say what they're doing is piloting random ideas or strong priors they have. I wouldn't call it experimentation in the sense of a controlled experiment where you're learning, A versus B. And there's, in principle, there's not much extra effort involved in going to that versus just trying this versus trying that.
I think another way of saying what Sameer was saying is that they're doing it anyway on the basis of their strong convictions that were formed probably in the 80s and the 90s when they were coming of age about what an organization ought to be like. And some of those are misperceptions. And some of those are socially constructed, to use a term we introduced earlier, beliefs about the nature of humans, which isn't actually the nature of humans. It is the nature of the world that you were socialized into. And so one of our biggest challenges is to persuade these leaders that maybe their preconceptions are incorrect. And if they experiment carefully, that might lead them to find better ways of recreating congruence between the social experiences and the technologies that we have.
I think there are lots of reasons for resistance, but I think one of them actually goes back to an earlier conversation that we had, which is about the ethicality, right, of surveilling, for instance. Don't you kind of run into some of the same questions with running experiments? I mean, I think that there's a discomfort in running experiments because of the implications to your staff, to telling your staff that, you're experimenting with their career. It's a serious question, right?
It came out recently. There was a big article in the New York Times about research that our colleagues here at Stanford and MIT did through A/B experimentation on LinkedIn. there was a big uproar. What? LinkedIn experiments with its users? Well, yes, so does the New York Times, by the way. We all accept, for example, at this stage, that if we are given a COVID shot, there was a randomized controlled trial that was done earlier such that you are not just given a shot without having had it tested thoroughly beforehand through an experiment. And I think it's a cultural shift that we need to go through. Of course, managers don't need to just haphazardly experiment with their customers or with their employees. But there's a strong case to be made that ethical experimentation leads to better outcomes for everybody, because employees will benefit, the organization will benefit, society will benefit. It requires us to kind of reboot that conversation and to make people less afraid about the idea of experiments, but also to put in mechanisms to make sure that managers don't exploit that in a nefarious way. Universities have institutional review boards because researchers in the 20s and 30s misused experimentation in really nefarious ways. Maybe that's something we should think about for-profit organizations as well.
There's also a kind of a vulnerability on the part of senior management to acknowledge that they have to experiment, that they don't know the answer.
Is it a vulnerability or is it a strength? Someone tells me, a senior leader at a firm, that they know the right mix of in-person versus remote. I don't trust them very much as a leader, right? If instead they say, this is not knowable, and here's the way we're going to get to a better answer, my trust in that person actually just went up.
And that's the cultural shift that we need. We need to encourage leaders to talk in that way and to show that successful leaders are actually aware of when are they making decisions that are based on strong evidence and when are they just operating on the basis of gut. And when I have CEOs coming into my classroom, they often say, students ask them, how did you make this decision? And they said, it was my intuition. That's a very dissatisfying answer. What does it mean, your intuition? Can I learn something from your intuition? As an investor, I would be taken aback if a CEO would tell me, I'm pursuing this strategy because it is my intuition.
Thank you both so much for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us.
If you want to hear more from Sameer, watch the New York Fed's webinar on shifting norms, the intersection between technology and culture in financial services, which you'll find at newyorkfed.org/governance and culture reform.